Western Marxism, section, The Cult of Arendt and the Erasure of the Colonialism-Nazism Nexus. For some time, the disdainful refusal to understand what was happening in the East with the anti-colonial revolution and post-capitalism had prepared the terrain for ideological capitulation. This brings to mind the cult devoted at a certain point to a philosopher who, having moved away from the positions of the extreme left, ended up defining Marx as an enemy of freedom who inspired totalitarian communism. I refer to Hannah Arendt, who in our own times has been somewhat adventurously compared to Rosa Luxemburg, and is one of the authors cited in Empire, a book that has been a major media success of Western Marxism. Already faint, the bonds linking Western Marxism to the world anti-colonialist revolution here break apart. The colonial peoples and those of colonial origin in the struggle for emancipation had long been aware of the close relationship between Nazism and the colonialist tradition. 1 year after the rise of the Third Reich, W.E.B. Du Bois compared the racial state that Hitler was building in Germany to the one that had long been in effect in the U.S. South, and to the regime of white supremacy and colonial and racial domination that the entire West had created across the entire world. Writing his autobiography some years later, the African-American author repeatedly stressed the essential point, quote, "Hitler is the late crude but logical exponent of white world race philosophy. Therefore, the democratic United States and the West, in general, had no credibility, founded as they were on the exclusion of the inferior classes, and above all the colored peoples of Asia and Africa." End quote. Significantly, the nexus between the Third Reich and the colonialist tradition was sometimes made evident by using the category totalitarianism. In 1942-43, while distancing himself from the violent methods that the communist movement was criticized for, an African-American militant of the extreme left, A. Philip Randolph, made clear an essential point. In speaking about Nazi Germany, the colonialist and racial empire that Japan sought to impose on China, that which Great Britain maintained in India, and about the white supremacist regime of the U.S. South, one could speak of Hitlerism, of racism, but also of totalitarian tyranny. The international situation was characterized by the struggle of the colored races against the various imperialisms and the different forms of racism and totalitarian tyranny. Totalitarianism was the power exercised by the so-called superior races over the peoples of color in the colonial world. In taking this position, Randolph referred to Gandhi, leader of the independence movement, who, in an April 1941 interview, declared, quote, "I assert that in India we have Hitlerian rule, however disguised it may be in softer terms." End quote. This method of argument was wrong to not provide the needed nuance regarding the existing differences between the political realities being compared, but was right to make clear their common traits. The idea of racial hierarchy, the idea that the racially inferior peoples were destined by nature and by providence to undergo the domination of the white or Aryan race. This set of ideas led Hitler to build the German Indies on the model of the British Indies, or seek in Eastern Europe the Wild West or frontier to subject and colonize, following the U.S. model. After the end of the Second World War, the view that linked the regime of white supremacy still in power in the U.S. South to the Third Reich was widespread among African Americans. One episode that happened in those years in New York speaks eloquently to this. An episode that, though she did not understand its full meaning, Hannah Arendt referred to in a January 1960 letter to Carl Jaspers. Quote, "The high schools of New York gave all the students of the senior classes the assignment of thinking up an appropriate punishment for Hitler. A Negro girl wrote, he should have a black skin put on him and be forced to live in the United States. End quote. In a fresh and ingenious way, the candid black girl imagined a sort of law of retaliation, in which those responsible for the racist violence of Nazi Germany would be forced to undergo as blacks the humiliations and bullying of the regime of white supremacy that they had untiringly propagandized for and carried out mercilessly. In these same years, the activists of the Algerian Revolution and their theoretician, Fanon, once again compared the French colonial empire to the Third Reich. And that was not only because of the ferocious repression they faced from it. What was the Nazi state, quote, if not colonialism, when rooted in a traditionally colonialist country? End quote. And, quote, not long ago, Nazism transformed the whole of Europe into a veritable colony. End quote. This view was not born of the character of a single personality, but from the conclusions arrived at by the anti-fascist coalition. At Nuremberg, the leaders of the Third Reich were condemned for having carried out a program of colonial conquest in the name of the superior right of the master race, and for having developed, throughout the Second World War, a gigantic system for draining and exploiting forced labor on a mass scale as, quote, in the darkest times of the slave trade, end quote. Hannah Arendt was also conscious of the nexus between colonialism and Nazism, and during the war she defined Nazism as, quote, the most dreadful imperialism the world has ever known. In those years, Arendt described imperialism with an eye ever to racist ideology and to the Third Reich, to the pretense of dividing humanity into superior and inferior races, into master and slave races, into higher and lower breeds, into colored people and white men. Imperialism's cult of race had led the British to define themselves as whites, and then led the Germans to call themselves Aryans. This explained, quote, the crimes of modern imperialism. The philosopher was thus very far from the theory of two more or less twin totalitarianisms when she hailed the Soviet Union, at the time led by Stalin, for, quote, the Soviet attempt to liquidate anti-Semitism in the context of a, quote, just and very modern solution to the nationality question, end quote. It was an appreciation that was repeated 3 years later. Quote, what every political and national movement in our times should give its utmost attention to concerning Russia, namely, its entirely new and successful approach to nationality conflicts, its new form of organizing different peoples based on national equality, has been neglected by friends and foes alike. End quote. Equally eloquent was her comment of January 1946. Quote, in the country that made Disraeli its prime minister, the Jew Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, a book which, in its fanatical zeal for justice, carried on the Jewish tradition much more efficaciously than all the success of the chosen man of the chosen race. End quote. The contrast between the two ideal-type figures of Judaism could not help but sound like a contrast between the Soviet Union, which never ceased to evoke Marx, and Great Britain, which, under Disraeli, had nurtured an ideology typical of imperialism and of Nazism itself. In any case, on the agenda was the struggle to tear up the roots of fascism for good. It was necessary to confront the unresolved colonial problem and white supremacy, not to mention the rivalry between imperialist nations. Thus, quote, this time fascism has been defeated, but we are still far from annihilating evil entirely in our times. Its roots are still strong and carry the names of anti-Semitism, racism, imperialism. End quote. The defeat inflicted on the Third Reich was not yet a definitive solution to the problem. Beginning of long quote. that at the end of an imperialistic age, we should find ourselves in a stage that would make the Nazis look like crude precursors of future political methods. Following a non-imperialistic policy and maintaining a non-racist faith becomes more difficult daily because it becomes clear how much of a burden mankind is for man." End quote. It was a point that she repeated powerfully the following year. Beginning of long quote. Imperialism, which first entered the scene towards the end of the last century, has today become the dominant political phenomenon. A war fought on an apocalyptic scale has revealed the suicidal tendencies inherent in every consistently imperialist policy. Yet imperialism's three main drives, power for power's sake, expansion for the sake of expansionism, and racism, continue to rule the globe. End quote. Finally, in December 1948, on the occasion of Menachem Begin, the future Prime Minister of Israel, visiting the United States, in an open letter to the New York Times, also signed by Albert Einstein, Arendt called for protests against the man responsible for the massacre of the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin, noting that the party led by Begin, with its, quote, admixture of ultranationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority, and of terrorist violence against the civilian Arab population, was, quote, closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. End quote. Promoting the merciless colonialist expansionism of a so-called superior race, Begin retraced the steps of Nazism and fascism. The nexus between Nazism and colonialism at times emerges also in the first two parts of The Origins of Totalitarianism, those devoted to anti-Semitism and to imperialism. First published in 1951, the book gave ample space to the ideological and political history of the British Empire. Edmund Burke's reaction against the French Revolution elevated, quote, the whole English people, establishing them as a kind of nobility among nations. End quote. Later taking form was racism, the main ideological weapon of imperialistic politics, along with eugenics, the new pseudoscience dedicated to improving the race through forced sterilization, or even more radical measures of the losers. Along these lines we find Disraeli, who proudly contrasted the rights of Englishmen to the rights of man, which he scoffed at, together with Arthur de Gobineau, who was one of the most, quote, devoted supporters of the race. Given these ideological assumptions in the colonies, a power without the limitations it faced in the capitalist metropoles began to be theorized and experimented with. It was a power that tended to assume ever more troubling forms. Already in the context of the British Empire, there emerged the temptation to carry out, quote, administrative massacres, an instrument for liquidating every challenge to the existing order. We are on the threshold of the ideology and practice of the Third Reich. Of Lord Cromer, the representative of the colonial power in Egypt, Arendt paints a portrait that does not lack analogies to the one she would subsequently paint of the notorious Nazi executioner Eichmann. The banality of evil seemed to find its first, weaker incarnation in the British imperialist bureaucrat, who, quote, in their indifference and aloofness, in their genuine lack of interest in their subjects, had developed a philosophy of the bureaucrat and a government without precedent that was more dangerous than the unorganized impotence of all those who are ruled by the tyrannical and arbitrary will of a single man. End quote. And this form of government that went beyond traditional despotism reminds us of totalitarianism. From the first, Arendt tended to use the category of totalitarianism to define the nexus between Nazism and colonialism. The first model of totalitarian power was exercised over the colonized peoples, who were dehumanized through racist ideology, decimated, and enslaved. The frame changes radically, however, when we move to the third part of the origins of totalitarianism, which is clearly influenced by the ideological climate that arrived with the outbreak of the Cold War. Analysis of the Soviet Union didn't matter very much, since, thanks to the category of totalitarianism, it was put on the same plane as Nazi Germany. What was decisive was the removal of the linkage of the Third Reich to the colonialist and imperialist tradition, of which it sought to be the more intransigent heir. A turning point was reached. While still in France, and before crossing the Atlantic in 1941, Arendt, according to her biographer, saw the piece she was writing, quote, as an exhaustive work on anti-Semitism and imperialism, and a historical study of that phenomenon, then called racial imperialism. End quote. The essay on imperialism she published in Commentary in February 1946 had been preceded by a note in which the reader was informed that the author was writing a book on imperialism, the Third Reich as racial imperialism, as imperialism that brought to their extremes the racial components of colonial domination and the subjection imposed on peoples and races considered inferior or stopped at a primary stage of social development. The Third Reich as the highest stage of imperialism. This vision inspired Arendt in the years after the struggle against Nazism and was still apparent in the first two parts of The Origins of Totalitarianism. It was imperialism and colonialism. It was processes that involved the British Empire and other Western powers that had played key roles in the genesis and development of Nazism. Read closely, the third part of The Origins of Totalitarianism was entirely different from the two preceding parts on racial imperialism. In the book as originally planned, still emotionally committed to the struggle against Nazism, the category of imperialism was at the center. The genus that subsumed various species, first of all, was the British Empire and the Third Reich, the most accomplished of the barbarisms of imperialism. And in this framework, the positive role of the Soviet Union was made clear, as the main protagonist of the struggle against Nazi imperialism and inspiration to the anti-colonial movements of national liberation. In the third part of the book, essentially written while the Cold War raged, the center instead jumped to the category of totalitarianism as the genus that subsumed the Stalinist USSR and Hitler's Germany. This new framework conferred a positive role on the entire anti-totalitarian West, including countries like Great Britain and France that, for all intents and purposes, still had colonial empires. The heterogeneous character of The Origins of Totalitarianism was not lost on historians. Immediately after its publication, the book was harshly criticized by Golo Mon. Beginning of long quote. The first two parts of the work treat the prehistory of the total state, but here the reader will not find that which they are used to finding in similar studies, namely research on the peculiar history of Germany or Italy or Russia. Rather, Hannah Arendt dedicates 2/3 of her efforts to anti-Semitism and imperialism, and above all, to the imperialism of the British matrix. I cannot follow her. Only in the third part, in sight of all that has been undertaken, does Hannah Arendt seem to be truly on message. End of long quote. Therefore, it would be substantially off message to dedicate pages to anti-Semitism and imperialism, yet she is explaining the genesis of a regime that Hitler declaredly sought to build in Eastern and Central Europe, a great colonial empire founded on the dominion of a pure white and Aryan race. Mon could not understand the calling to the bar of the British Empire. In his critique of Arendt, he sought to involve Karl Jaspers, who had heatedly asked, quote, Do you also think that English imperialism, in particular Lord Cromer in Egypt, has something to do with the totalitarian state?" End quote. The German historian considered it an act of treason against the free world to throw a shadow of suspicion on a country that, more than any other, incarnated the liberal tradition. He would have done well to read the description from the 19th century that an illustrious liberal British historian, Thomas Macaulay, had written of the regime imposed in India in crisis situations by the government in London. It was a reign of terror to which all the injustices of the preceding oppressors, both Asian and European, appeared to be a blessing. And again, notwithstanding the Philistine indignation of the Cold War ideologues, the government practices in the colonies of the liberal West led the way towards totalitarianism. The heterogeneous character of the origins of totalitarianism was grasped by other historians, who called attention to the artificial efforts needed to make Soviet communism the totalitarian equivalent of Nazism. For example, inventing a Bolshevik pan-Slavism that would have been the counterpart of Nazi pan-Germanism. All in all, quote, regarding Stalinism, the book is less satisfying, and the lack of a clear theory of totalitarian systems becomes quite evident. To be more precise, quote, in many passages, the analysis of the Soviet Union appeared to have been mechanically made similar to that of Germany, as if it had been later inserted for symmetry's sake. End quote from Gleason. Certainly, Arendt's book on totalitarianism, quote, was actually, in the main, an explanation of the rise to power of Nazism, and focused in its first two sections on anti-Semitism and imperialism, themes with little relevance to the nature of Soviet power. End quote. It would be worthwhile to bid adieu to the category of totalitarianism, which aims only to destroy the USSR through an artificial but deadly comparison with Hitler's Germany. End quote from Ian Kershaw. More on the heterogeneity of the book. If for Goloman it is a question of eliminating as off-message the first two parts that, together with anti-Semitism, accused colonialism and imperialism, for the later historians cited what was problematic was the post hoc and ideological character of the third part, adapting itself to the ideological needs and practices of the Cold War, sought to breathlessly link the Soviet Union to the Third Reich. And now we read in Empire, a key text of Western Marxism, quote, it is a tragic irony that nationalist socialism in Europe came to resemble National Socialism. End quote from Empire. In retracing the history of the first half of the 20th century, the two authors erase the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism, or between the reaffirmation and the abolition of colonial slavery, ending up with the positions of the Western champions of the Cold War, determined to criminalize communism, absolving and reducing to trivia colonialism and imperialism. End section.